Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started then. We're going to be talking about Orientalism and Asian American theory in this elective, so thank you all for showing up. I know most of y'all are coming from a worlds background, although there's a few LDers, so I've tried to slightly skew this lecture a little bit towards addressing more of a world's population. So we're going to focus a little bit more on Orientalism and how that affects sort of global discussions, especially in a world's context, rather than solely on Asian American theory. Of course, if you have further questions, both of these topics are probably like extensive. Like you could take courses on both of these classes in college. So it's definitely, not going to be comprehensive enough that we're going to get through everything, but hopefully we'll be able to introduce some of y'all to just these perspectives so that you can use them in both how you think about debate arguments as well as how you think about your life in general. So with that, we're going to start with just like a quote from a very famous person. Does anyone know who Edward Said is? If nobody knows, that's okay too. Honestly, I wasn't totally aware of Edward Said's works until maybe last year or so. But Edward Said is sort of the founder, I suppose, of this overall branch or literature of Orientalism, right? So I'm just going to kind of introduce like where the philosophy and the literature comes from before we kind of dive into the theory and how that's applied to debate and to the world. So if you all can recall, like just learning about like, philosophy or critical theory in general, right? I think most people perhaps might have covered events in the 1800s in the colonial era, right? And also the sort of events that happened or surrounded that, right? So things like the scramble for Africa, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that kind of divided up the Middle East, right? Western like colonialism, and like all of how that relates to basically the project of empire building in the Middle East, in Africa, in all parts of the non-Western worlds, right? So this sort of literature that we're going to be talking about today is coming from an angle that arises out of those colonial circumstances and addresses the sort of oppression that occurs on those levels, right? So Edward Said, who is a Palestinian author, is writing in the context of post-colonial theory, right? And what post-colonial theory really refers to is just after these sort of colonies kind of are supposed liberated, right? That is like, for instance, when Algeria was seceding or freed from France's rule, when India was like kicking Britain out, right? When all of that started to occur in these anti-colonial movements after World War II, right? Edward Said and Orientalism is sort of retooling this overall understanding of how we address non-Western countries. How do we talk about them? How do we know what we know, right? And that's kind of the core question we'll be talking about, is how Orientalism, right, which I will get to define it in a second, sort of is able to influence what we know, right? How we formulate our knowledge, right? And how we think about other big other capital, right? Nations or countries or regions, right? Including and especially those of the East. So Edward Said, and his quote up here is kind of symbolic of his overall theory, right? He says that every single empire in its official discourse has these circumstances and its mission to enlighten, civilize, bring order and democracy, and use force as apparently like a last resort, right? However, right, if you think about, what the West and the US proclaims to do in, the Middle East, or what, like, for instance, Britain was claiming to do in India, right? Bringing civilization, enlightening the people, right? Helping them restore democracy, right? And only using force. Obviously, that's like a very big illusory lie, right? So it's not definitely true. And a lot of these colonial empires are built on the backbone of violence and oppression and the exploitation of these colonized peoples, okay? So I've talked about a lot just now. Does anyone have questions so far? Are y'all excited for this elective now? Does it sound interesting? Was it what you imagined Orientalism to be? Let me just like kind of gauge, like, okay, like what did y'all think this elective was going to be about? Did y'all Google what Orientalism was? Like, just some thoughts, you know, let's make this more of a conversation and a discussion rather than just me talking at you.
I feel like I knew that it was gonna be about like the East Asian kind of values, I would say, compared to the Western. So
Mhm.
I came in like knowing about that stuff. But the part about Orientalism is still something new, I would say. That I
Yeah,
still don't know.
fantastic. Okay. What else? Sophia, what did you think?
I actually like Googled what Orientalism is. I think that's how you say it.
Yeah.
And then I saw it was like about like the traits of Asian Americans and like I don't know, I didn't really know anything about that concept, so I thought it would be interesting.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So I hope like everyone is kind of coming from that perspective, right? Of course, like I'm going to be going relatively quickly through this lecture. So if you have questions, like stop me anytime. I'm going to use this as like kind of like a period every now and then to just like ask for questions. If you have one, like please like ask me, okay? Because this is going to build like pretty quickly. So I want everyone to be on the same page. All right. So with that said, let's just kind of go to defining Orientalism, right? I'm going to show some examples, some images in a second, right? But really, what Orientalism is referring to is this divide between the East and the West, right? So the Orient, right, is really just like a code name for the East, I suppose. The Occident is what is known as the West, right? So these are the terms in the literature that Edward Said establishes for post-colonial studies and what these like philosophers and critics are talking about, right? And what they define Orientalism to be is really just a way of seeing the world that imagines, emphasizes, exaggerates the differences of these non-Western civilizations and Eastern cultures as exotic or backwards or uncivilized or dangerous, right? It is important to note that the West, right, generally refers to what you would think of as, you know, the US, Europe, Britain, like colonial countries, right? Um, just basically think of like countries where most of the population is white, because Orientalism is intertwined with this concept of race, right? And also how we envision race as a global sort of dynamic, right? I will also clarify that the East is not just like East Asia, right? It's not just China or Korea or Japan or any of those other general sort of associations we might perhaps have at a Asian American debate camp where most of the people are probably Chinese, right? So it's not just, you know, China, right? It is rather this sort of encompassing idea of non-Western nations, right? Meaning the Middle East, right? India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, as well as like Africa too, right? So all of this is sort of juxtaposed together as like a dual or a binary between these two general ideas or identity positions, right? So just as you might have like black and white in the United States, right? There is a divide between the East and the West on a sort of global scale at the level of thought, imagery, stereotypes, and just ways of talking about these general sort of countries that fit within the East or the West. Does this all make sense so far? If I say like if it makes sense, people don't have to like reply, but if you could do like a thumbs up reaction so I know that like you're still following, that would be fantastic. Okay. Okay, fantastic. So with that said, right, let's go back to what Edward Said defines Orientalism to be, because he's kind of like the founder of this like whole theory, right? He wrote a groundbreaking book called Orientalism in the 1960s, I believe, and was just like straight up like that opened the doorway to post-colonial studies and Orientalist studies too. So he says that Orientalism is this acceptance in the West, right, of the basic distinction between East and West as a starting point for elaborate theories, novels, epics, social descriptions, political accounts, images, right? Literally everything about the Orient, its people, customs, its mind or rationality, and its future and its destiny. Okay? So again, like think back to how this connects to the East as like a broader, unified world, right? And this divide. So wish I had a picture of that, but let's move on a little bit more just at the history of Orientalism. Very quickly, does anyone have questions about what Orientalism refers to or what the definition is? Hopefully it's going to get more clear. Let's take at least one question before we move on.
So like Orientalism in its essence is like a negative connotations that describes the East of the world.
Yeah, so Orientalism, right, generally refers to like these sort of negative connotations that are prescribed to the East and non-Western peoples, right? But also, I would say that Orientalism also refers to the structure, right, or the production of knowledge about the East. So it is not just like stereotypes, right? Just like racism is not just stereotypes. Racism is like a structure or these institutions that are set up in society to disadvantage groups of people or a certain categories of identities, right? Orientalism is beyond just stereotypes or how we think about something. It is in fact present in our rhetoric, right? When we talk about China or the Middle East, right, as like, potentially growing threats or competitors of the United States, right? It is present in how we think about other countries, right? So like when white people in the US are like, like these Middle East people are just all terrorist or whatever, like obviously that is not true and also problematic, right? So that also kind of goes back to these ideas that we'll be exploring in a second. But just be aware that Orientalism is a structure, right? And it's not simply a stereotype or an individual account. Cool? So let's go a little bit more in depth. The history of Orientalism kind of dates to the period of the Enlightenment and to colonization of the Arab world, but also, at the concurrent time, right, colonization of Africa and of other places, like, parts of Asia too. I know like Hong Kong might be an example, right? So all of that kind of goes towards the branches of the European Empire, right, and its reach across the world, right? So these first Orientalists, right, which is different from, well, like just think of Orientalists as like the people who are perpetuating Orientalism or these stereotypes, right? The first Orientalists were 19th century scholars who translated writings of the East into English. And they did this because they thought that in order to effectively govern these colonies, right, we have to know the knowledge of the colonized or dominated peoples, right? So for instance, right, there's philosophers who like went to India, right, and were like, like we should like seek to understand like the Bhagavad Gita or the like actual like scholars who are in like Hindu civilizations and like how we actually like think about how that manifests itself in the knowledge of these Indian colonies, so like very like, I suppose like problematic way of thinking about why we should gain knowledge, and I think it illustrates a sort of objective of Orientalism, right, which is that it is almost always coupled with imperialist ideologies, meaning that Orientalism works hand in hand with imperialism to justify the occupation of an area, to justify colonialism, right, to say that like these colonized peoples are not civilized, they need help governing themselves, and therefore they require Europe, right, or the West to help them govern themselves as a colony. Cool? So Orientalism is this rationalization for colonialism based on the history of which the West, right, which these European scholars helped create to construct the East as different, inferior, and in need of Western rescue. Does this kind of make sense as a general idea? We're going to get a little more concrete from here. So we're going to come back to this, but are there any questions so far? No? All right, there are definitely questions, but I will let you off for now. So let's talk a little bit more about the idea that knowledge and representation is power, right? So remember, right, these European scholars, right, are kind of traveling and they're thinking and they're like, like we want to know as much as we can about the Orient, right, about the East, so that we can kind of communicate that back to the West, right, and sort of create a more effective governance or colonial rule over these people, right? An example of this, right, is like when European artists, even not just scholars, right, but artists went to the Arab world and like started painting like just their imagination, right? So while some of the artists were like very true to the world, they're kind of like actually like painting what they saw, right? A lot of them were just kind of depicting their own fantasies, right? They're trying to depict the Arab world as an exotic, a mysterious place of sand, of belly dancers, of just various like historical Orientalist fantasies, including camels and oasis and like all these kind of stuff that continue to affect our contemporary popular culture, right? So when you think about Aladdin, like all of that is still very much tied up to these Orientalist perceptions, right? Because like, for instance, right, I was studying in Morocco this year for like Arabic and everything. And like a lot of people, right, like coming back and even like going to Morocco were like how was like living in the desert? And I'm like, bro, like I was right next to the ocean. Do you really think there's a desert in like Rabat, you know, which is the capital of Morocco? And like, it just doesn't make sense, but it goes to show where all of these sort of images and stereotypes kind of come from as categorizing certain regions as having certain traits, right? And it goes beyond simply the depictions, right? But also the sort of stereotypes of the people too. So representation, right, is then kind of claimed as solely the power of Western authorities or experts or artists who are traveling to those places and kind of depicting whatever they imagine, even if it's inaccurate or if it reflects only their own sort of stereotypes, right? I will say like another example, right? A lot of the pictures that people kind of circulate from like photographs of, I think it was like a colony in Africa, right? Were actually like staged by photographers, right? In certain ways so that they look realistic, right? But only reflect what they simply wanted people to know or to see, okay? So does this kind of idea of representation and how knowledge plays into power make sense? Let's take a question before we move on. Anyone like this painting? I think it looks cool, actually. It's very Orientalist, but like, you know, it looks nice. Nobody has a question? I can't move to the next slide until somebody asks something. All right, yeah. Sherry?
Okay, so how did the power like actually get to the Western people? Because even now those like stereotypes are still what we think of.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that like, I think the sort of representation of stereotypes, especially because like we live in the West, right, are kind of perpetuated because of what was brought back by like Western artists or scholars or people who like traveled to what we refer to as the East, right? So obviously, right, if you're living in China, like during this whole time, right, you would have like a very different reality. You would have certain stereotypes of your own about the West, right? About like maybe white people, about like African people, right? There are certain stereotypes that are located by region, right? But growing up in the West, and because of the West cultural dominance, right? And their sort of historical influence as the rulers of empire, of colonies, of their extended sort of control of the world, right? Think back to like Britain, France, Spain. They controlled probably like, you know, half of the world's like territory at some point, like maybe less. I don't know the exact statistics, so don't quote me on that. But like they had like literally influence all across the world, right? So if we are sort of starting from that perspective, right, obviously the reach of the West is going to be very prominent when we consider how far they've gone, the travel, the sort of ships, the sort of connections that paints between stereotypes and cultures and the representation of that. So it's much easier for the West to come in with these Orientalist stereotypes and like depict the Arab world or Africa or China as certain things. And those images, right, are locked in for centuries, right? And they're still present today because the history has not changed, right? We still live in the West, right? If the West stereotypes today are informed by history and informed by the perceptions that people or like Western scholars brought in from the Arab world, like these paintings, right? It's not going to change significantly. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Anyone else have questions? That's a fantastic one.
Wait, I get that like these painters or like these experts, like when they put out this kind of information, it like exaggerates the differences, right? But how does that exactly like play into power?
Good question. I think that actually helps transition a little bit into our next slide, because I think the next question is, okay, why like does this representation, why does this artist painting this painting, right, actually mean anything, and why does it become a problem, right? So I want to answer that with this slide here about like Orientalist stereotypes and how it comes into play with the sort of like representation of certain peoples and countries, right? So Sophia, I'm going to actually expand on your question a little bit after when we talk about why Orientalism is detrimental and the impacts of Orientalism. But let's like recognize some of the stereotypes that come into play, right? So it's not just paintings, right? There are certain sort of associations that Orientalism come to shape our perception of Eastern countries, right? So when we think about unstable or rogue nations, right? Iran, North Korea come to mind. They're always almost like at the top of, like Trump is just like bashing them. They're like, you know, like they're a problem. They have nuclear weapons. They're going to destroy the whole world, right? They're not responsible. They can't handle nuclear weapons. We have to take them away from them, right? Of course, you know, there's like a valid policy perspective to both sides, right? But like, it's interesting that we see this sort of discourse around Iran not being able to handle their nuclear weapons, right? Versus when, you know, like Britain and Russia, like, and like all these other white Western countries, like when Russia was in the Cold War, right? Like, yes, we had like propaganda against them, right? But it wasn't the same sort of Russia is uncivilized or they're rogue or unstable, right? As it is today with Iran and the portrayal of their governance, right? And this is also seen in when we talk about or depict the Near East, the Middle East really, as like a terrorist inflicted state, as filled with civil wars, and in general, just incapable of handling the ability to govern their own people, right? And all of that kind of goes back to the sort of origin of colonialism and how we sort of represented that history, right? I think note that this is very hypocritical, right? Because the US, the West, right, are saying that Iran and the Near East are unstable and are terrorists and all that kind of stuff, right? But in reality, right, who perpetuated all of these sort of circumstances, right? It was the US who invaded Afghanistan, right? It was the US who started drone striking people in the Middle East and like just taking people out and causing like more instability. Also ensuring that like terrorist organizations would easily have like martyrs to point to increase their recruitment, right? It was also the US who like basically created ISIS and despite like, you know, their counter efforts against Al-Qaeda, right, and other terrorist organizations, they've only radicalized people even more because of the injustices that they have inflicted in the Middle East, right? So it's, I think, very important to kind of see both sides of the issue, right? Especially when schools are kind of telling you the sort of more American, Western-centric version of history, you have to be able to flip it and kind of see the other narrative. Anyone have questions about the first stereotype that we're talking about? I know it's a lot to take in. What is a rogue nation?
Would a rogue nation be pretty much something that the West considers to be somewhat communist and doesn't view their so-called like government in their way?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a very good example, right? I think like for instance with like President Trump's like overall like rhetoric around China, right, is a good example of what you just said. So different, but also dangerous, right? China as authoritarian, China as not respecting human liberties, right? China as undemocratic, right? And communist, which is a threat to our capitalist democratic systems, right? In reality, of course, it's not that simple. And, you know, capitalism and democracy has also failed a lot of people in the United States, including a lot of people of color, right? So it is a tendency to kind of magnify the negative aspects of other Eastern nations while also ignoring our own Western flaws. If that makes sense. Cool. I hope that helps a little bit. Is this interesting so far? Okay. Let's go on to like the second stereotype then. So this idea that is painted by Orientalism with just showing how other Eastern countries are incapable of handling their own problems. They're inferior, they're childish at times, they're immature, right? And this is obviously like portrayed in conjunction with the sort of narrative that the West has to come in and save them, right? They have to be their parent in a way, right? So an example of this would be, the sort of attack on China right now for like their inferior handling of the coronavirus issue, right? While in conjunction, Donald Trump is like, like Kung flu and like all these other like racist slurs used to refer to the coronavirus as originally Chinese, even though like a virus can't be Chinese, right? So in that context, right, we can kind of imagine how people in nations in the West are very, very quick to blame other countries, and especially the East, for problems that they have also contributed to, right? So think about like, why does Donald Trump, right, always like point to China with like these issues about how they should have contained the virus or anything, right? When he had personally like a month and a half of like head start, and now the US is like, top in the millions of coronavirus cases, right? So this sort of portrayal, this binary or double standard, right, is oftentimes used to level up Western countries and at the same time push down Eastern countries. Does that make sense? Okay. Trump is childish, that's just a fact. But yeah, we're gonna move on from that. So the third stereotype that I wanna address is the idea that like the East has these uncivilized and exotic cultures, right? So think about, for instance, like Islam and how that gets negatively portrayed in the United States and in the West, right? A lot of times, like people are like, like all Muslims are terrorists, right? Which is obviously false. And they're also like, wow, like I wish like I could wear a hijab. It seems so fashionable, right? So at the same time, there's this like weird, like, okay, like Muslims are terrorists, right? But like I kind of want to appropriate their clothes and also their culture in a certain way because I think it's exotic or interesting, right? It is a fashion statement in some senses, right? So that kind of goes to like cultural appropriation and also how that plays out in the West, right? I also heard like yesterday apparently that like there's like white people like wearing like Chinese like qipao or like dresses and all that kind of stuff from like a cultural perspective at prom in the United States. So that would be also like a very good example of just this exoticization of Asian women and of Asian values and objects, right? So that kind of is taken from the history of, think back to those paintings, right? When these artists were like, oh, like the Orient is just so like exotic. It's so mysterious, right? It is so interesting, right? And at the same time, they're kind of like, look, like this is not like capable of actually governing themselves, right? They're uncivilized. Therefore, we have to do it for them. We have to make sure that they make the most of what they have, like the mystery and the exotic sort of objects, right? And use that for them, right? So I hope this kind of contextualized things a little bit too. Are there questions about that? Is there any like other example maybe people could think of? Have y'all ever had like somebody at like school or whatever who was just like, I don't know, like when you're like bringing food like in middle school or something, and it's like Chinese food or like ethnic food as they call it, right? And they're just like, oh, like, wow, like can I try some? Like that seems so cool, you know? Like has that ever happened? Yes? No?
Well, for
Every time I
me,
bring dumplings to school, everyone's like asking for some.
Yeah.
whenever I brought like my like culture food to like school, like I've always had experiences where people like were like, ew, what is that? Like that's so weird. Like, ugh. And then they're like eating peanut butter sandwiches. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like,
So basic, you know?
yeah.
So like, yeah, I think like, just like think about like how this affects your daily life, right? Because there are certain sort of aspects of Orientalism that are certainly still part of our everyday experiences, right? So like, there are two different reactions that we just kind of highlighted here, right? There's the ill, like it's different, it's mysterious, I don't know what it is, right? And at the same time, like, ooh, like it's interesting, it's exotic, I want to try it, right? And that's kind of reflected on a global scale too, right? When we're thinking about products from like, like Korean beauty, right? When we're going back to history, right? And talking about like, I don't know, like silk and like how that's traded, right? Like all of this kind of goes into history, and it becomes a lens to sort of view these different events and experiences that seem different, right, but are actually connected by this overall ideology that is Orientalism. Cool?
I just wanted to get your like what you would say like about the fact that that we saw like Russia as a so-called equal, even though like they were also out in the east side of the hemisphere, and like how race has such a big factor in like how power and race is such a big factor in like how people perceive each nation.
Yeah, I think that is such a good question. Thank you so much for asking that. I like seriously appreciate that question because I think it goes to show sort of the differences, right, between our representation of white countries that would supposedly be geographically in the East, right, and also countries that are perhaps close in proximity or in geography to the West, right, maybe Europe, to places, but like are just not white enough to meet that standard, right? So think about, as you said, like Russia, right? We saw them as equals, right? We were like, look, yes, they're communists. Yes, they're, you know, all these things like propaganda, like whatever, like the U.S. would say about like their communist people, right? And that kind of goes into like class issues, right? Which I'm not going to touch. But contrast that with like China, right? Because like our sort of rhetoric around Russia is still very much like, okay, like we see them as like our rivals, right? Whereas like with the rise of China, right, it's less about rivalry and more these days about like a threat, right? China is stealing our jobs. They are invading our overall like technology, right? They're pushing us down. They're becoming the global hegemon, the global ruler, right? Their military is becoming stronger. Like this is bad, right? Like we need to stop them, right? Yes, maybe there's on some level the same sort of rhetoric around Russia, right? But it is very much race in that sense. And I also think that to my earlier point about like geographical proximity, but differences in race, right? Russia is in the East, right? And theoretically we would think that like they're an Eastern country, right? But because of the whiteness that lies within like the populations and their proximity to Europe, right? Even though it's so big, we kind of associate them with the West, right? We consider Russia white in every sense of like how we talk about it, right? In contrast, right, we have like, you know, Turkey, which is like right borderline like Europe, right? And like for some reason, right, we consider Turkey like part of the East and part of like the overall like culture of Eastern civilization, even though it's technically closer, right? But the difference is that they are raced in such a way that their people are not white, right? They don't count within who is this category of whiteness and Europeanness and Western identity. Does that make sense? I could definitely talk about this longer because like I enjoy talking about this, but I'm not gonna like rant too much about it and we need to get on with this. So I'm gonna take another question in a few slides, but let's just cover like the last sort of stereotype, right? Which is around the idea of Eastern civilizations having this element of irrationality or they're illogical in certain ways, right? So when I was like going to Morocco, right, I was like repeatedly told like by this sort of like cultural education program, right, which is just like basically an institution or like a very Western approach to like how there are differences between the East and the West, right? And they were always like reiterating, look, when you're talking with people from the East, right, they're always going to use this sort of circular thinking. They're not going to actually like be direct about saying something, right? It is certainly different in terms of communication, right? But very much to the point that an Orientalist stereotype, right, is oftentimes taking that to a next level, right? So not just the fact that people take a little bit longer to say something directly, right? Because, you know, like that is considered more rude. If I were just like, you know, like asking like for a job directly in South Korea versus in the US, like I would get very different reactions, you know? And if that's the case, right, this sort of cultural differences are then twisted into justifying, okay, like because they're less direct, because they're less circular in their communication, more circular in their communication, less logical, right? They are somehow backwards or irrational in a certain way, right? So then this value of rationality, right, which we can kind of trace back to the European Enlightenment and all these like philosophers who's like, like I'm enlightened, like I know everything about the world, right? In reality, like John Locke and like Rousseau and all of these white philosophers, right, were very much heavily influenced by Eastern scholars too, reading their works, right? There's an inseparable connection between the two, but somehow we always associate logic with the West and illogical values with the East, right? So one example of this, which we'll see in the next slide, is like Orientalism in pop culture, right? So taking an example of Mulan, right? Love the movie. I'm a fan. Like it did a lot of great things, right? But at the end of the day, still very Orientalist. So this idea of self-sacrifice, right, with Mulan, like literally like donning like military sort of like recruitment to serve her family, to save her like father and like replace him in the army, right? I think everyone has watched Mulan. So that sort of like self-sacrifice is valued in the East, right? And, you know, I think like most of us would be like, yeah, like that's a good thing. You should do things for like other people, right? But when we kind of contrast that with the West, right, with this overall larger drive towards individualism, right, caring about our own self-preservation, it is much harder to understand. And I think there are certainly stereotypes involved that kind of take Mulan to like a very Orientalist next level, right? Which is like realistically, I'm not really sure like how accurate this would actually be in real life. You know, of course it's a work of fiction, but like, does that kind of make sense?
And also like going off of this idea, I think that like the West definitely really like values this idea of independence, or like it's my freedom to do what I want more. Like with the coronavirus, you know, when they issued like it's like mandating wearing masks and stuff, like a bunch of people like in America were like, no, it's my choice, so I don't have to do it. So I think that's like also a major difference between like the East and the West, which I think is like also really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. That is a great example too. Like more individualism, more independence, right? So a lot of these anti-maskers, right, are very much subscribed to this narrative that the West is like a free place, that we have individual rights here, right? Versus how that contrasts with like South Korea, for instance, which, you know, had pretty much like the same sort of first case timeline, right, in coronavirus, but like handled the outbreak significantly better than the US did. And that's like by orders of magnitude, right? So how that portrays into like an overall distinction, right? I think kind of goes to show like the negative impacts of Orientalism, right? So we have on one hand, like a very much like homogenization, which is just another word of saying that everyone is seen as the same, right? And not actually diverse or different anymore. So Eastern civilization is just kind of lumped together with the same stereotypes, even though like, you know, India is different from Africa, which is different from China, and Russia is like, you know, not even seen as the East, right? So obviously like the differences even within these countries, right? And when we think about Asian Americans, right, who came, right, we kind of see all Asian Americans are the same too. So, you know, doesn't matter like if you're like Vietnamese or Korean, or like Indian, or like, I don't know, like Cambodian, right? You're still gonna get the question like, where are you really from, right? So that kind of goes down to this sort of functional identifier, which is a core category of race and difference itself. I mean, how that links to Orientalism. Cool. I'm gonna expand on that a little bit. Let's just finish the slide. We'll take more questions. But the other sort of impact of Orientalism is dehumanization, right? So this is where we see that the lives of people in non-Western regions, right, are much more dangerous, right? We don't value them as much as lives in the West, right? Which is why, like, you know, a lot of white people in the US are kind of just like, yeah, like we got to have like boots on the ground in Iran. Like we need to just like take them out, right? Like some people are like, we should first strike North Korea with a nuclear attack so that they don't like attack us first, right? So there's a much more willingness to go to war with them, to like send in like troops to invade like Afghanistan, you know, for like countering terrorism, right? When in reality, like we're also just like taking their oil because that was a very large economic incentive. So like there's like so many just hidden sort of motives, right, that go into colonialism and the extension of imperialism in the modern day world. that continue to occur in this. Also, I forgot to mention, but like y'all don't have to like write down everything word for word in the PowerPoint. I'm going to send all of this to you all, and the recording is going to be uploaded into the Google Drive. So if it helps, like just like sit back, like just like listen, you know, like maybe take some notes by hand, but don't worry about writing everything word for word, because I know there's a lot of blocks of text. Should have mentioned that earlier. I apologize. Back to dehumanization though. So again, like this is kind of like where we find like the Vietnam War, right? Where we find like the scramble for Africa, where everyone in the West was kind of just like, we got to like divide up Africa and like chunk it out, and then just like, you know, take these colonies for ourselves, right? That, like, imagine like all of these scenarios and all of those sort of modern day wars, right? And the history of that, right? Whether it is Vietnam, the Korean War, Afghanistan War, invasion of Iraq, like all of this, right? Like, would that have ever happened to a Western white country? No, I don't think so. So like, it just like, it's very much like raced in that sense, right? And it's very much affected by this discourse of Orientalism that goes on to justify the ability for us to invade Vietnam, to, you know, like divide up Africa, to like colonize certain territories, right? That also links to the last impact of Orientalism, which is white saviorism, or this idea that the East is not capable of taking care of itself, and they need the West help or power, right? So this goes into like paternalism, right? Which is the idea that the West needs to be the East parent, or like older brother in a sense, you know, and we have to help them, right? And I say help in quotation marks because that help is usually like military intervention or colonization, or like sending in troops, right? So for Vietnam, for instance, right, we were like, oh, look, like these like poor innocent people who are being taken over by a communist regime. And like, granted, like there were issues and there was very much like a genocide going on too, right? But also like the way that the West like handled that sort of issue, and sort of portrayed it as like, okay, like we're going to go in to save these people, right, from these injustices, very much is hypocritical, considering that it committed a lot of these injustices, right? They exploited these countries, they colonized them, and still are saying we should help them even more. Okay, so end of rant here. Questions, please.
Okay, I know this is like a super big open question, but like, what are your thoughts on like the underrepresentation of Asians in media?
So I think that is very much, I don't know how to answer this question because like, you're right, it is very broad. But in the context of Orientalism, maybe, I would say that like, especially with like Asians in media, right? I think that there is a very interesting divide between how we consume media from the United States and from the West, right? Versus how we consume media from like the East, right? So like Bollywood is like the biggest film and just like TV industry in the world, like in terms of like numbers, right? But somehow that is still like very much stigmatized in the United States, right? People are like let's watch like a Indian movie, right? And like other white people are like, ew, like I don't understand, like why are there so many dances? Like why are there so many songs? Like they're just like complaining, you know? Same thing with like K-pop, right? Like I'm like, yeah, like I listen to K-pop and people are like, what? Like you listen to K-pop? Like you know what that is? You know, and it's just like very like characterized as just like weird or exotic or just like not belonging, you know? And I think that kind of relates to how everything kind of plays out with Orientalism, because it does ultimately go back to this fundamental divide, right? Between how we consume and represent images of the East and the West. Was that helpful? Okay, other questions? I like these. Let's keep them coming.
You talked about like stereotypes the West puts on the East. Are there any like the East puts on the West?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are stereotypes, and I can say like, you know, like, I think like, you know, if you go to like China, right? When I was in Morocco too, they kind of think of the West as like being like very individualist and like free in that sense, with like, not always free in a good way. They'll be like, you know, like white women are like, just like very much idealized in a way that they think they're like sexually promiscuous, but also like desirable at the same time, which is like a weird stereotype, but also very much like reflective like racial and colonial conditions, right? They also have like certain aspects of like, I suppose like like you can definitely tell from like a lot of Chinese propaganda too that like my like grandparents or whatever receive, or my uncle in China receives, that like they have their own sort of machines, right? Especially in China, where they're like, yeah, like these like protests and stuff, and like these riots mean that like the U.S. is like destabilizing, when in reality, right, like the Black Lives Matter movement and like the George Floyd protests have very much their own element of racial justice involved in them, right? So they're sort of like twist to represent the U.S. as like unstable too. I think certain implications, but aside from that, I think that asking what are the stereotypes of the East on the West, right, is not necessarily the right focus, because at the end of the day, right, the East did not colonize the West for the most part, and also like it just does not have the same sort of dynamic in terms of power and representation worldwide, right? So I think it's interesting, but not necessarily relevant to the theory of Orientalism, if that makes sense. Other questions?
I kind of want to just get your thoughts again on the fact that sometimes as the West have like developed those like individualist views and stuff, and they've gone like very bipartisan, and it's hard to like move different things in the government being a democracy, and how like especially in the East there's a lot of communist stuff, like regarding the coronavirus, how it's so hard to just lock everybody down and contain all the cases, whereas like in like just South Korea and back home, like where I'm from, Malaysia, like of course the case started going up and then they locked it down, and they had the power to do that,
Yeah.
and that in turn contained the virus really well, and like how like those two play hand in hand, how like democracy can sometimes be bad in some
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's not just like, it may not necessarily always be like democracy, right? But also I would
Yeah.
very much attribute it to like individualism and this like lack of collective values, right? So you're absolutely correct, right? In Eastern states where they have a little bit more emphasis on collectivism or like the community, right? The public health as like a whole rather than your individual freedoms, right? I think it's significantly easier to be like, yes, like everyone needs to do this, right? For the health of the community, right? Versus people in the US who are like, look, it's my choice, it's my freedom, right? I can wear a mask. I can also not wear a mask, even if other people around me are dying, or if disproportionately people of color, right, especially Black communities, bear the brunt of my impact of not wearing a mask. So I think you're definitely correct on that. Other questions?
It's also kind of weird how like the Scandinavian countries, we can see like, for instance, the coronavirus, like they handled it so well by like government like restricting them, and then they're also a democracy, and we can look at US and they're like,
Yeah. So it's definitely like a spectrum too. I will invite y'all to take a look at, I think Hofstede's sort of like cultural spectrum. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but like Google, actually let's do this right now. I think I know what it's called, but like, okay, this one. So if you, I will send this link in the chat, right? But I see like y'all are asking a lot of questions in terms of like cultural differences and like acceptance. This is a very cool tool to use. And it was actually introduced to me by my World School Debate coach because it kind of shows like the sort of different values that each country has, right? So if I type like let's do like Malaysia, maybe, as mentioned earlier, like we have like what these factors mean, right? And like how they all sort of like come into play. So individualism is like very, very low, right? Compared to the United States, which is like, wow, like 91, you know? So that definitely plays in a role in how that actually affects like people's responses and policy actions. So I'm gonna send this in a chat and y'all can play around with this a little bit later on. I'll actually include it in here, but I can't actually see the chat right now. So, oh, here it is. Anyone have questions in the meantime? Applications debate. I know like I also have some other like, you know, additional stuff about Asian American theory, but we can go into that in a second. Other questions? How do y'all think that this could affect like applications debate? I'm sorry, someone else was talking though.
Well, especially in LD, couldn't like Orientalism be used as like critiques and like
Yes.
theories and to show? Okay.
For sure. So this is in LD like a pretty popular critique, I'd say, especially one about Asian Americans and representations of like China or the East, right? I'll give an example, right? So if the affirmative or proposition side is like one of their contentions or substantive arguments, depending on what you call it, is that China is like a threat to the United States because they are like becoming more powerful and they're authoritarian and they're like undemocratic, right? Potentially like those are all, if you're an LD, link arguments for a critique, right? But in worlds, you can also use that as like, look, here are responses to this argument. First, they rely on a very Orientalist conception of what China and how it's represented, right? In fact, we would say that this is a racist perception of how we talk about China. In fact, here are the facts about this, blah, 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 blah. Also, this means that you should, reject this argument on face because, it is Orientalist and also problematic, right? You'll be surprised, especially on an international level, like how many people are just like problematic in like the way that they articulate arguments, not just in terms of like racism, right, but also in terms of like gender and class and like just like representations of countries in general. So it definitely reflects on who the team is and how you want to be aware of how you can use that to like at least diminish their credibility, if not like land like a very devastating attack, Other example I'll give for worlds debate is that you can also use these to inform your arguments too, right? So if like, for instance, I got a motion about like Asian collectivist values in contrast to Western individualism and like which one we should prefer, right? And evidently, right, that is going to relate to Orientalism and how we kind of view both of this like East-West Asian European divide, right? So that comes in handy when you're presenting like a substantive about like a culture argument or some sort of reason why collectivism is better, and you can definitely build your arguments with the lens or the viewpoint of Orientalism authors to kind of understand a more critical implication of how to construct your theory, right? Because at the end of the day, right, there are sort of these overarching theories, right? Orientalism and colonial theory, post-colonial theories like being one of them, right? And you can apply that to individual perspectives or events or arguments to kind of analyze and criticize what they're talking about. Does that make sense? Other questions? Anyone else maybe have an example? Okay. I think we're good for Orientalism, but I just want to show a connection to Asian American theory. I know we don't have like too much time, but hopefully this is also interesting for everyone. Remember how we were talking about the representation and sort of imagery as a starting point for how Orientalism came to form, right? The sort of way that I think Orientalism connects to the portrayal of Asian Americans is very much so that first, right, we are inherently tied to our countries of origin, if you will, and there is obviously going to be like a sort of burden of representation, right? As like, for instance, a Chinese American, right? People are going to automatically associate China's actions with my identity, right? Second, though, I think Orientalism also is able to help us understand Asian American identity because it allows us to kind of connect those two sort of global instances together, right? So in this example, right, this is actually a historical painting or whatever of like the Yellow Terror in all his glory. So this was 1899. It was, I think some of y'all probably at least went to the Making of Asian American elective yesterday. Can somebody tell me what the Yellow Peril is?
I'm pretty sure it's the idea that like a lot of people in America hated Asians being here because they were like taking their jobs and something like that.
Yeah, so you're definitely correct, right? Like, but not just taking their jobs, right? Also, this sort of like demonization, right, of these Asian Americans as like dirty, as savage, as hardworking, but also threatening to the American economy, right? So you can clearly see, right, this sort of representation of a Chinese man, right, holding a gun with like the long, like braided hair, showing his, I suppose, like weird, like masculinity or kind of like diminishing his sort of status as like a real man, you know. There's also like stereotypes like he's like, you know, standing over this white woman, right, representing like the pillaging, the rape, and the sort of murder of white civilization, right? So you can definitely understand how these sort of images, right, play into the sort of dynamic of modern stereotypes today, right? And also how this all affects both on a global scale, Orientalism, and also on an American level, right, Asian American identity. Cool. There's some important terms I want to cover. And this is just going to be like a kind of brief introduction to Asian American theory. But I think first, all of y'all should probably be somewhat familiar with the idea of like hyphens and in this case, hyphenated identity, right? But like a lot of times, right, people will write Asian American with a hyphen, you know? And there's like a sort of meaning to this if you think about it, right? Because as an example, right, what do your grandparents say, right, when you're like speaking like your native language or like, you know, like when you're at home and you're like visiting them, like what do they like usually tell you about your Asianness? Anyone can answer this.
I mean, my grandparents don't really mention anything about it, but I feel like they're kind of talking about my Chinese behind my back.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, mood. Yeah, me too. What else?
I would say that like it's not specifically my grandparents, but like my cousins who are in Korea, they're kind of like they like trash talk like my Korean, but also like that I'm whitewashed, so I'm like too Americanized. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Key word, right? Too American, right? So in Asia, right? Like when I've been to China, right? People were like, "Oh, like you're an ABC, right? American-born Chinese, like you're not really Chinese, right?" But here in America, people are like, "Bro, like where are you really from? You know, like are you actually like American? Because like you don't look American, right?" So it's very much a testament to existing in between both Asia and America, right? But not being either. We're not Asian enough in Asia itself, right? But we're not also American enough. So somewhere in between that identity, right? We sort of oscillate or bounce in between both of these poles, never Asian and never American at the same time. Deep, I know. But anyways, like next one, right, which is a forever foreigner, is kind of connected with this idea, right? But taking along the idea that like Asian Americans, right, never are really truly seen as belonging in the United States, right? So for instance, right, Japanese internment, right, these populations of Japanese citizens, right, who had been living in the United States for like generations, right, and suddenly they like during like after Pearl Harbor and World War II had their Americanness questioned, right? They had that citizenship like almost pretty much taken away from them. They were locked up into internment camps, right? In other words, like treated as un-American, right? So that sense that even no matter what, or like no matter how long we stay in the United States, right, no matter how hard we try to assimilate, we're never going to be fully American. We're always going to be seen as foreign, right? Associated for Japanese Americans with their Japan or their home country, you know, despite like the time or the duration that they stay in the United States, right? So this is the idea of the forever foreigner, right? We are always foreign and we'll always be so forever. Also deep, but it's cool, you know? Model minority, can somebody tell me what that is? Yeah, Sherry.
So like my parents made me watch the documentary. It's like model minority is like kind of the Asians mostly, like we try to assimilate and become as American as possible while losing our own culture to try to fit in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. I think that's a great explanation. I will also connect that to like the model minority myth as well, which is the idea that like all Asians, right, are smart, they're hardworking, they're passive, they can assimilate, right, they're obedient, they're not that political, they don't really have like, you know, that much unrest, right, and they're kind of just there to be there. They're basically American, but just not white, you know, and of course there's like problems with this, especially when like, growing up as an Asian who wasn't that good at math or who like just like wasn't like too smart, you know, but like it's just like very different depending on who you are, right? Depending on what you're good at, like all that kind of stuff. So I had a good question in the chat from Jeanette about whether or not hyphenated identity applies to other races. yes, I think absolutely like African American, right? Or just like other races, right? Like would definitely have this sense of not being either or, right? But also I think it definitely relates to Asian Americans as well. I will say in terms of immigration, right? These sort of dynamics of Asian American theory are also tied up to immigrant theory in general, right? So all immigrants in some sense, well, I should clarify, like all non-white immigrants, right, come to the United States with some sense of never being able to belong. But again, like that is also very applicable and specific to Asian Americans as well. Last thing I'll say in this part is like white ideals. So this last section is just about how, as mentioned earlier, right, like this idea of like the Asian model minority, right, always strives towards assimilation, right? We strive to be white in a sense. Like we go to like top colleges, right? We do our work. We don't like rock the boat too much, right? A lot of times like we don't even vote because like we're afraid that like our political sort of perceptions are going to reflect poorly on our job or something, right? And because of that, right, we sort of try to just like fit in as much as we can. And in that sense, fitting in, right, means to be white. Because America inherently, right, is always going to kind of be perceptually tied to the idea of whiteness, as in the West and as in, Orientalism in general. So I think that's also interesting to note. Questions about these like terms in general?
I don't really have a question about it, but I kind of find it interesting how like unknowledgeable the West can be sometimes, because like with a lot of my friends when I was here, and they'll ask, like, of course, like there is Islam people in India and stuff like that. They're asking me like, bro, are you Islam or stuff like that? They're very like unknowledgeable of like what different cultures are and like what they represent and stuff. So it's just kind of like funny to see.
Yeah. Also the fact that they're like, are you Islam rather than like, are you Muslim? Like that's sad, bro.
Yeah,
Like that's like
totally.
people thinking Africa's a continent.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother thing. But yeah, I'm definitely with you there. I know we don't have too much time left, so I want to wrap this up a little bit just with like a kind of a sample of a Asian American theory that is usually referred to as like Asian melancholia, right? So I ran this as a critique in Lincoln Douglas debate. If that is relevant to anyone, and I'm happy to talk about it more in like office hours or any sort of time. But basically, like I've kind of like summarized the thesis here, right? Which is that like if we connect all of these sort of terms that we just talked about, right? Asian American identity then is hyphenated, right? It is displaced. It is always foreign, right? And therefore, we will never be able to fully assimilate into America, right? Which is what is referred to as the suspended assimilation, right? We're here, right? We exist, we live, we try to assimilate, but we're never fully going to get to the status of being white, right? But even though we fail to fully assimilate and fully ever become the model minorities that like white people want us to be, right? We still idealize being white, right? We still idealize these white values, right? And in doing so, distance ourselves and our identity from other sort of people of color, from blackness, right? As a contrast to whiteness. And also in our own personal terms, we try to remove our Asian values and homelands and cultures and languages, right? So I think like, for a lot of people, including for myself, right? In middle school, I was like very much like problematic. I was like laughing along with like racist jokes and everything. Like people would be like, oh, like your eyes are so small. I'd be like, yeah, I know, bro. Isn't it so funny? And like, like it's just like at some point, right? Like you try to fit in, right? But you can only do so much to the point that you still have some grasp of your identity of who you are, right? And this sort of melancholia, right, which is really just like a fancy term for like to describe like a state of mourning, right, is a overall theory that is presented by these Asian American authors who are writing in the context of addressing Asian American depression, of addressing like our identity, right, in critical theory, right, and they say that our Asian American identity, right, is characterized by melancholia, right, which is defined as an endless state of grief, right, where Asian Americans cannot recover losing both white ideals in our attempted assimilation and also our Asian origins, right? So it's interesting to kind of consider. I don't want to spend like too much on this because I know like for some of y'all, like although interesting, you may not necessarily think that it's like too relevant for debate purposes, but I'm happy to talk about it in more I also have the full copy of the book, which may be a little bit difficult to read, but I also have like notes on this. Like this is a separate lecture, so I'm just kind of including this in here as a preview. Does anyone have questions? Okay. We have about 3 minutes left. So I kind of want to expand a little bit more then on just like this idea of melancholia, right? So I think like, just like some food for thought, right? But this loss of both our own values, right, in Asia and our sort of cultural objects, right? And also the loss of being able to attain whiteness and fully assimilating causes us to internalize a certain hatred for ourselves and for other people of color, right? So this is why, like, you know, in the context of the book, right, that I was talking about, they were addressing like why or you know, what could possibly be the psychic reasons behind Asian Americans having record high like suicide and depression and mental health rates that are both undiagnosed, right? So we never know the true extent of them, but also proportionately just several times higher than like, you know, other white people, right? And that's kind of the explanation for like how we kind of internalize that hatred and racism upon us. And then also at the same time, like you have like, you know, like Asian parents or like all these like other people in Asian American communities who are like, like we are the good model minority. It's like, why can't all these black people just like pick them up themselves by the bootstraps and just like work harder, you know, like we did it, like we made it over here, like we got the big bucks, like why can't they do so too? So that's also like an interesting implication, right, of how like the model minority affects other people. Last thing I'm going to say before I just like open this up, and I know it's almost time, but like the other sort of advocacy, right, that An and Han, who are the authors of this theory, propose is that we have to kind of lean into Asian values once more, right? So the last thing I want to leave you all with is this idea that in order to fully recover our loss, right, in regards to our Asian values and also of our inability to fully assimilate, right? And also like just everything we mentioned before in terms of Orientalism and how all that affects our everyday lives, right? Being able to recenter our identity around the kernels or little bits of our culture and homeland and language, right? And the sort of lost Asian objects and identities that are part of our heritage and culture is able to result in this act of love for ourselves and also a revolt against these racist structures, right? And this is kind of what they're theorizing is the implication or the advocacy, right? The authors are saying we should refuse to assimilate, right? We should subject ourselves to freedom from these whitened ideals, these stereotypes, these burdens that we place on ourselves, and fully live out our lives as Asians, but also as Americans. Cool? So that's kind of where I'm at. Are there questions? Was this cool? Okay, this is like, I love to talk about this stuff because I think it's very interesting. It's also very relevant. So please come find me if you have questions. Let's like, you know, I'm not going to hold you all longer because it is technically lunchtime. But if you want to stay a little bit, chat about any of the things I've just said, or just like want to discuss more, I'm happy to do so. In addition, if you all want to like have a little bit longer of an extension, I can like schedule like a session during office hours if y'all want to continue this discussion. What are your thoughts?
Okay, I'm going to be honest. I didn't know what was going to happen when I signed up for this elective, but I really enjoyed it.
Okay, I'm very glad. That makes me like that makes this lecture worthwhile. So I really appreciate that. Anyone else?
I thought like this lecture made me realize like a lot of things that I just like viewed as, you know, like normal, like the hyphenated identity part. I thought that was so deep. Like I literally thought it was just like grammar or something, but there's like, yeah.
No, there's social and political implications to how we write and, you know, the text that we use. So that is very important. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
At first I thought it was gonna be like, I don't know. I was like, what if it's like not fun? But then and then I realized it was really fun. And then like I learned a lot of new stuff. Cause like I always thought that like being like not Asian and not American was like a normal thing, and I didn't know that it was actually like an effect of like racism or something.
Yeah.
Oh, and also like there used to be this thing where like or like your parents tell you is like, oh, don't do this in public. It'll like make people think like Asians are like bad. But then now it's like, why do we have to think about that? Like white people don't have to think about that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%. These are, I love this. Keep them coming. I also recognize if you like have to go to lunch or something, you know, because it is break. Would you all like to like continue this discussion, or I can also talk more about like specific like Asian American theories too, like go a little bit more in depth on this last part about Asian melancholia. Would you all like to have like an extended session during office hours or anything?
Sure.
Yes. Can you like put like yes in the chat if you're interested in that? Because like I also have some other like people I have to talk to for like office hours per se. So I don't know if I actually have to schedule time in, but I'll let you all know depending on the interest.
I mean, I think it would be really insightful to do like further discussions about like Asian melancholia and so yes.
Okay, cool. I'll try and make sure that happens then. All right. Do you all have like any other questions to leave off of? If you have to go to lunch, you know, like feel free to dip out. I'm gonna stick around for like a few more minutes, but y'all should definitely, like, you've been sitting for a while, so please get up, eat something, and then go to lab. Okay?
Thank you.
Of course.